Thank you everybody for joining us today. My name is Armytage. I'm responsible for the overall operations of AgBiTech here in Australia. We've got some of AgBiTech Australia's team here with us. We've got Ian Summerlade and we've got Caitlin Langley. Ian's based at Beerburrum in the Sunshine Coast, and Caitlin's based in Wagga. We've got Gustavo Shiomi, who's based in Sao Paulo, as well with us, and we've also got Welch, who's also based in Canvas. We've been getting lots of questions with regards to controlling fall armyworm in sorghum. Coming into a large plant as we have at the moment, we've got a lot of crop out of the ground. I thought it was a good opportunity, since we have, I think there's over 70 people in the field in Brazil who are working with AgBiTech on the ground in Brazil around multiple species, but particularly around fall armyworm. And we've got a large team also in the US, which Rock is part of, who have been dealing with fall armyworm for many years. So we thought it'd be a good opportunity to plug into that expertise and bring the international expertise. But we've also got Dr. Melina Miles here with us today. And Melina has been the one who's been absolutely instrumental with the initial work for the introduction of Fawligen into Australia, and doing the work on the ground from a research perspective about understanding this pest. When we, January last year, when we encountered fall armyworm in Australia for the first time here, and I let my colleagues around the world know that we actually had fall armyworm here, the response came back with great elation, because they said, finally, at last, Australia has this pest, they'll work out how to control it, which doesn't give us a great deal of hope for the fact that we have a huge volume of relevant information that we can use here for Australia. But it does mean that we need to ensure that we're investing in our research capacity here to understand the pest and also see what we can learn from overseas. Our approach with the rollout of Fawligen has been pretty much a warts and all approach around how you actually control fall armyworm, particularly in maize. And we're looking to continue this with regards to fall armyworm and its presence in sorghum and what the issues would be. If anybody's been through the Fawligen accreditation program, you'll understand the expression when I say that Fawligen is very much a chicken nuggets type insect. Insofar as if you've ever had anything to do with teenage boys, if there's chicken nuggets available for breakfast, dinner, and lunch, that's what they will eat. But if they're not available, they'll eat pretty much anything else. So our understanding is predominantly fall armyworm are a pest of maize and the sweet corn, popcorn, some of the sweeter grasses. But it does get into a whole host of other crops, including things like capsicums, and it's been known to be found in sorghum. So what I would probably do is we'll kick off initially with Melina, who will run through what we know here in Australia, what her thoughts are, what's and all about the pests, what we do know and what we don't know. But I would point out that the introduction of a novel pest into a landscape in the first couple of years can be quite different to how it actually falls into place over successive years once it gets established in the landscape. So Melina, I might just hand over to you at this point in time if you want to run through what you might physically have. I'll just stop sharing here.
Thanks very much, Philip. Yeah. So I guess, as Philip says, we don't have a lot of experience at this point in Australia. Really, we have probably 2 sorghum seasons under our belt. And I think that, the observations that we have made at this point, I'll just run through them just to give you a bit of a sense of how we think things are tracking. But I am very aware of that point that Philip made, is that potentially things could change. And whilst at the moment I feel quite comfortable about the prospects of managing fall armyworm quite successfully in sorghum, if we find that the pressure comes up dramatically, that may well change. So I guess, sort of hedging my bets here a little bit between what our observations have been to date and how we feel, given that limited experience, and the prospect of perhaps it changing in time. The first thing I wanted to just say is that there is a really big difference between the pressure and consequently the impact on crops between the north and the south. So, the Bowen Burdekin area, for example, experiences much higher pressure than does the south, and the southern regions, probably from central Queensland south into northern New South Wales through the Downs and so on. We're seeing plants that have all the characteristic appearance of fall armyworm infested plants. You can see that on the left there, the holes, sort of to varying extents, but those patches of plants are isolated. It's often quite a long walk from one infestation to the next, in comparison with what we have seen in the north, which is, you know, probably at least 100% infestation of plants. The characteristic fall armyworm damage is here, and you can see that in contrast with that, what we know of damage to sorghum in the vegetative stage caused by Helicobacter, it's much more extensive, partly because we see multiple larvae in that whirl, which is not something that we tend to see with Helicobacter. And I think if you are seeing these elongated holes in leaves as they start to expand, if you're seeing the whirl, the emerging leaves cut off, then you could be pretty confident that it's fall armyworm, but still very important to dissect those plants and have a look for larvae. The situation during the reproductive stage seems to be much less clear. So we see fall armyworm larvae pushed out of the whirl as the head emerges. But I guess my observation at this point would be that if you see a 5th or 6th instar fall armyworm on a sorghum head, either as it's flowering or starting to fill grain, it is not doing anywhere near the sort of damage that you would expect to see with a Helicobacter of the same size. So yeah, look, I look forward to hearing what the experiences are in Northern and Southern America, because this is one of the key issues, I guess, for us is we don't have enough experience to understand exactly what the response should be going into this head emergence stage and post-head emergence. The other thing that's really important, I guess, to acknowledge is that sorghum is as vulnerable probably as maize is in the establishment phase. And this is what brought a lot of growers unstuck in the first year, is just a lack of understanding or realization of how quickly damage can accumulate at this stage. So probably we're talking up to maybe V6, V8 at the latest. And what you get is you can get quite severe defoliation, starting with the small amount of windowing, progressing to quite severe defoliation. And then if larvae, I guess the experience has been that if larvae are allowed to progress or do progress to this late instar stage, they sit at the base of the plants out of the sun, and they can actually cause the death of those plants by feeding on the meristem and burrowing up the stems. And that was really, in my opinion, the basis for significant crop loss of both sorghum and corn in the north in the first year that we experienced fall armyworm. So what this highlights is that there are two things going on in terms of management. The first is preventing significant loss of leaf area, and the other is managing the population so that you don't get these very large and very damaging larvae, because there's nothing more yield loss inducing than a dead plant. But the other thing that's worth saying is that, you know, these are photographs of plants from blocks that were planted at the Air Research Station and subjected to natural infestation. And what's immediately obvious is that the corn is far less able to cope with the infestation of fall armyworm. One of the observations would be that we seem to have persisting high densities of fall armyworm on corn in comparison with sorghum. It seems that you can have the same egg pressure, but we have seen the populations of fall armyworm in sorghum reduced to not much more than one per plant at these early stages quite quickly. And if anybody else has any experience with why that comes about, that would be very interesting to understand. The other thing I just wanted to stress is that, you know, there is still quite considerable confusion about whether it's Helicobacter or fall armyworm, and I think this year has shown that there's quite a lot of Spodoptera lutura or cluster caterpillar in sorghum and maize crops as well. So identification, these are large larvae, which makes it relatively easy to distinguish, but you know, there is still a significant challenge for crop managers around getting that identification right. Now, given that people are managing crops, we've sort of been put in a position where with very little sort of on-the-ground experience, and you know, it's been necessary to provide industry with some guidance around how you might approach the management of both sorghum and corn. And this is a preliminary management strategy that we've been talking with industry about, which really does highlight what is obvious to us, which is that the early stages, the areas in red or pink, are absolutely critical. Managing the populations, preventing the build-up of the population is absolutely critical. This period through here, the vegetative stage from about B5, B6 through to head emergence, is really a little more, a little less clear, and that's where the work that's being, we have some investment from GRDC now to look at developing guidance around the management of fall armyworm and sorghum and corn, and these are the areas where we'll be probably putting most of our effort in understanding what needs to be done in this, at this crop stage, where it is also incredibly challenging to get good control. And then, I guess, coming into flowering and soft dough, I guess partly this is about population managing the population and preventing there from being larger larvae. Whether that is actually how it needs to be, this is not the final by any stretch of the imagination, and I guess we're learning as we go, and we're hopeful that within the next couple of years we will be much more confident around a management strategy for sorghum. When we're talking about management, it's really important to acknowledge that fall armyworm turned up in Australia with some insecticide resistance already, and the work that's been done by New South Wales DPI, by Lisa Bird, and funded by CRDC, screening those early populations of fall armyworm from across the north in particular, has shown us that there is very high resistance to synthetic pyrethroids, higher than the resistance that we see in a selected Helicobacter armidra population, if that gives you any context for just how unlikely it is that you get good control with synthetic pyrethroids. And similarly, carbamate's moderate resistance. So I think for Australian agronomists and growers, the message is, if you wouldn't target Helicobacter with a synthetic pyrethroid or a carbamate or an OP, although there are no permits for OPs for fall armyworm, then you shouldn't be targeting them against fall armyworm, because they are at least as resistant to those products as Helicobacter armidra. However, the good news, luckily, is that there is no resistance evidence in any of these products that I've got listed here. So, chlorantraniliprole, indoxacarb, spinettaram, emamectin benzoate, NPV, and I haven't put on BT, but because there are no permits, but BT is an interesting one, and we've been doing some work with it over the last couple of weeks, and there is some good efficacy out of some of those BT products. So that's another one that may be useful in situations, particularly where withholding periods are problematic. So, hay production or forage production. When it comes to permits, there's a plethora of permits for fall armyworm management in Australia now. But when we look at specifically at sorghum, the list is much shorter. So there's a permit here which includes some products that you just simply would not target against fall armyworm, one of the very early ones, Success Neo, Magnet, MPV, Fawligen in this case, and chlorantraniliprole. And this is the recent permit for chlorantraniliprole use in sorghum, which I think has been very welcome given the limited options to this point. So where are the risks? Well, I think if you're sitting in the north, there seems to be a perception that this is a really big issue, and that a no-holds-barred approach is necessary. And I guess what I wanted to do here is just quickly flick through the fall armyworm pressure as measured by pheromone traps over the last 18 months or so, just to give you a sense of how different the pressure is in the south and the north, and maybe to allay some of your concerns that you are going to be absolutely overrun with fall armyworm and the impacts on your crops will be devastating. So what you see here is small dots with a cool color, relatively low pressure. As the number of moths trapped per day increases, the dot gets bigger and redder. So I'm just going to flick through this quickly so you can just keep your eye on the date on the top and on where that pressure is. And so you can see for most of the year the pressure is in the north, And last year, it wasn't until we got to October, November that we saw a big movement of fall armyworm into the south. And then those pressures pretty much across the board stayed pretty cool, apart from some of those areas where, you know, in the coastal areas, so the Fassifern Valley, the Lockyer Valley, and then again, the persistent high pressure in the north, driven by, you know, not only, I guess, maize, but also sweet corn, and similarly in these areas. So you can see here that, you know, we do get some areas of high pressure into early autumn, but then it starts to contract. So there's, you know, the last year has really been, you know, relatively low pressure in these major sorghum growing regions. So I think that you know, we don't know how that's going to pan out, but I think that is worth keeping in mind as a sort of context to the experience in the south, in central Queensland south in particular. I mentioned earlier that, you know, there are two things going on. One is perhaps protecting the crop from direct feeding losses, and the other is managing the population. In the life of a sorghum crop, it's possible, if they were to turn up as soon as the crop was out of the ground, that there might be 3 generations. And then with each generation, the population increases and the pressure on the crop similarly increases. So when we talk about population management and some of the strategies that might put in place, why it might be important, even if you're not suffering significant crop losses in this early stage or this early stage, vegetative stage, that there may be some value in managing the population depending on the susceptibility of the subsequent crop stages, or indeed if there are successive planting, so an early plant and a late plant, it's possible that the early planted crops may be a source of higher populations of fall armyworm for the later crops. So there's a bit to understand around that. And this is just to illustrate that if fall armyworms to turn up later, you know, the multiplication effect is significantly lower. One of the other things that's worth mentioning is that we've seen some agronomic practices that just aren't going to cut it anymore now that fall armyworm's here, and in the north particularly, you know, the challenges associated with managing weeds that are also, or volunteers that are also hosts for fall armyworm. These have created quite significant issues, not only for things like sorghum and maize that are planted into weedy fallows and then sprayed out, but also to the pulses that might be planted into those weedy fallows. And maize and forage sorghum windbreaks have also turned out to be a bit of an issue with the larvae moving from those to neighbouring crops and doing some damage, although they don't persist in many of those crops. There is some good news as well. There's this bit of good news. Natural enemies. We weren't expecting to see a lot of activity when it comes to natural enemies, but in fact, we have seen a tremendous amount of activity. And in this part of the world, well, where am I sitting? I'm sitting in Toowoomba, so on the Darling Downs and through the coastal areas into northern New South Wales. At this time of year, both this year and last year, we have seen an enormous amount of Cotesia parasitism. So Cotesia, just here on the bottom left-hand side, is a larval parasitoid, produces fluffy white cocoons as before the wasps emerge. We are running currently at somewhere between 30 and 90% parasitism. And last year we saw the fall armyworm infestation in November in Weewar, northern New South Wales, completely decimated by the activity of Cotesia. The other thing that we've seen in trials in unsprayed situations is quite good levels of trichogramma parasitising the eggs. And then there's a whole raft of other parasitoids and predators that are showing some potential. And Metarhizium riley, I know last year in southern Queensland in particular was somewhat wetter year than we've had for the last 10. And we saw a lot of this Metarhizium riley fungus. So I think that, for those who are concerned that you're reliant entirely on insecticides to control fall armyworm, that absolutely isn't the case. And if you're not selective in the products that you use, you're actually shutting the door on some quite high levels of natural enemy activity that, and I guess what I like to say is, these natural enemies can get to fall armyworm in places that you could never hope to get insecticides. So considering them as part of the equation is very important. I just quickly wanted to, I guess, give you a little bit of a heads up on some of the work that we've been doing as part of the sort of economic threshold management project. We've teamed up with UQ with a view to looking at developing plant models that will give you some forecasting ability around what the impacts of fall armyworm might be on your crop. And a preliminary trial just to test some methodologies and so on was done by Joe Eyre in the last summer. And you can see here, this is maize in this instance. I'll get to sorghum in a tick. And you can see that there's quite big differences in how these crops have grown because of the different spray regimes and the different fall armyworm pressure. And where it was unsprayed to V12, those plants essentially never recovered. And you can see that wave effect here, so from the side view, quite dramatic. And you can see that early damage, so the crop was sprayed every week subsequently, so there was no ongoing fall armyworm impact. But you can see that early damage had a flow-on effect that really did impact quite significantly on yield of that crop. Right next door, we had exactly the same treatments applied to sorghum, and this is what we got. And what you can see immediately is we don't have that wave effect, that the uniformity to head emergence was pretty good. There was a delay, but not a significant delay. And I think that, again, that's an encouraging outcome. And okay, so just wanted to say thanks for the opportunity to talk to you about the experiences to date, and just to make them and acknowledge the investment by the Queensland government in this work. Thanks, Philip.
Lovely. Thanks, Melina. Look, we do have Gustavo and Brock to run through, but any quick upfront questions for Melina, and we'll have some questions at the end as well. Has anybody got any questions? We don't have a huge number of people, so if you just want to unmute and ask, that'll be fine.
Melina, I'm interested to know, do you have any idea, like you were talking about the Cotesia in Weewar as a beneficial that could be used to suppress the populations potentially of fall armyworm. Do you have any ideas about how we can quantify if they're there best in the paddock, or how we could potentially encourage these beneficials?
Well, I guess in terms of Cotesia, we know that we're most familiar with Cotesia from native armyworm species that are, potentially pests or are resident species in winter cereals at this time of year. So I think that that link with Cotesia is probably through the proximity of those native armyworms and fall armyworm. We do see quite a lot of native armyworms in things like maize, for example, perhaps to a lesser extent in sorghum. So I think that that does raise those issues around the management of native armyworms in other crops as a reservoir for those natural enemies. But the number one recommendation is don't go after fall armyworm or with those broad spectrums, because that really does just shut the door, and a kind of little known little sort of recognised side effect of the use of things like Success Neo and Entrust is the dramatic negative impact on parasitoids as well. So there's a bit to understand and to sort of communicate to industry about how you best retain those things. But given that I think that this is probably is better dealt with by a passive approach than an active approach. Just without doing anything, we are seeing dramatically high levels of Cotesia activity. So it's more a don't disrupt it than a do something to encourage it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Melina. Brock's based in Kansas, and as I said before, where he is in Kansas is a pretty good analogue for northern New South Wales and the Darling Downs. Brock's been a specialist in our company for many years now, and with a wealth of experience in the US with managing fall armyworm and also exposure to sorghum. Brock, can we just hand over to you to have a bit of a run through?
Yes. So Brock Welch, I'm based in the United States. I cover everything from, if you know where South Texas is, all the way up to South Dakota in the central part of the United States. First off, Us United States growers are a little bit behind from you guys in Australia. We brought this over here in 2016 and really didn't launch it in the United States or in Kansas or in the Great Plains until 2017. And then from that point on, as you can see, Adam Baldwin was our first customer in the United States out of McPherson, Kansas, which is only about an hour from where I live. He was kind of fighting the similar things you guys were in Australia, resistance to pyrethroids, killing all of our good guys or beneficials that we need to hang around. Adam Baldwin, he was kind of the first one in the United States or in the sorghum producing areas to use Fawligen or Vivis Max in Australia. And then as of today or 2021, we are on roughly 50% of the sorghum makers in the Great Plains area. For example, most of our sorghum makers are in the northern part or central part of the United States. So fall armyworm can be somewhat few and far between. Kind of like Melina was saying, in the United States, it mainly just shotgun holes sorghum leaves in the vegetative stages. Fall armyworm, for the most part, in the central part, more northern part of the United States, does not affect in the reproductive stages. South Texas is a little bit different. They can get 50-50 mixes of headworm or helicoverpa and fall armyworm. And then, for example, so here's the maps of Kansas and Texas, which are two major producing states in the United States. There's roughly 4.2 million acres grown in Kansas, and then 1.6 million acres grown in the state of Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, and South Dakota. Fall armyworm, for the most part, seem to stick to higher rainfall areas. So, for example, in the state of Kansas, our average rainfall is roughly, give or take a couple inches here and there, 30 inches a year. And then in South Texas, they can see up to 50 plus inches. I think last year they were actually at 60 inches almost. So they seem to find and follow the higher rainfall areas. And when they do get into sorghum crops in those areas, again, it is mainly in vegetative stage sorghum. And for the most part, we have in the United States not seen a yield reduction in feeding from vegetative sorghum. So Texas, again, has the highest pressure of fall armyworm and sorghum. Most growers and consultants will see a 50-50 mix of headworm and fall armyworm and sorghum. Again, that's mainly in vegetative sorghum. Kansas historically has little to no fall armyworm pressure present in vegetative sorghum. Fall armyworm damage in the United States shows no yield damage again. Mainly just that ugly look that we don't like to see, the window painting on the sorghum leaves or holes. And then in the United States, sorghum production, it is very rare to use synthetic insecticides to control fall armyworm in vegetative sorghum. I would say 99% of the time it ends up growing out of it. We kind of have that go fishing for a week attitude. If you see fall armyworm holes in sorghum, a lot of guys just kind of don't go look at it for a week because they'll cycle out and then gets a good rain shower or some sun to it and the stuff will grow out of it. High beneficial loads in our sorghum fields will naturally keep fall armyworm in check. Our good guys over here are minute pirate bugs, ladybugs, and lacewings. They seem to feed on fall armyworm eggs. And then most years, if we get the rains like we normally do, a natural fungus will show up in our production and control fall armyworm as well. So the final message is we try not to use synthetic insecticides unless it's 100% necessary. And it seems like out of a 9 out of 10 year type cycle, we're going to have either our good guys, our beneficials helping us out, control fall armyworm, or the fungus seems to take them out. So for the most part, a Fawligen application or a Vivis Max application seems to be the only thing that goes out. But sometimes every once in a while we will throw a Fawligen and Fawligen combo together if somebody is slightly worried about finding a few fall armyworms here and there in grain producing heads. So, and that is all I really have.
Fantastic. Thank you, Brock. What we might do is we might just hold off on questions for you. Gustavo, did you want to run through the Brazilian experience, and then we can come back to some questions more broadly? I should point out we've also got Murilo Moriaro with us as well, and he's also based in Brazil. We had him billed as a speaker as well, but Gustavo seemed to have the technical edge. So Gustavo, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Philip. It's great to be here. My name is Gustavo Shiomi, everyone. I work for AgBiTech's Brazil. So I'm here to share some of our experience with Fall Armyworm and baculovirus in sorghum. So Spodoptera frugiperda, aka Fall Armyworm, is our #1 caterpillar pest in Brazil. So due to its really flexible, adaptable nature, has been a major concern for the most relevant crops in Brazil, namely corn, soybeans, cotton, which combined represent 58 million hectares. So due to our climate and intensive agriculture, we can have up to 9 generations of this species per year. So it's a big deal. And all these populations, they have been exposed to a lot of selection pressure. So sadly, we've been observing a lot of resistant populations in our main agricultural areas. So it's in Brazil, we can observe some populations. We can observe a resistance to up to 32 active ingredients. So it's a really not really favorable scenario. And we've been having commercial success with our product Cartogen, which is the same thing as Fawligen, the same product, just different names, with regards to this pest. And we successfully led this process of inclusion of group 31 in the mode of action table with IREC. So group 31 insecticide is the group, the mode of action for the baculovirus, of course. And IREC, just to make sure everybody's on the same page on the acronym, is the International Resistance Action Committee. So it's from the industry to try to prevent resistance in the field. So we firmly believe that these products are excellent IPM tools, not only for their novel mode of action, but also for its extremely low toxicity profile. As for sorghum, in Brazil, this is a mostly secondary crop, which means lower investment. Here we have three main types of sorghum: grain sorghum, silage, and biomass. This third one is for ethanol production. So these look up to, they sum up 700,000 hectares in Brazil, and they're mostly concentrated in this region here, in these 3 states. What farmers usually do here for managing fall armyworm is they monitor mainly the vegetative stages. And usually what they do is spraying 1 to 2 times exclusively for fall armyworm. And usually what they use here is cheap knockdown insecticides. Okay, and usually they only do this, they only spray when they realize that the damage caused by the fall armyworm is impacting in the number of viable plants in the field. Okay, usually we don't observe a lot of fall armyworm in the reproductive stages, so usually we don't see a lot of damage in heads caused by fall armyworm. We do observe some damage with this other species here. Of course, Helicoverpa, it's a problem. It's way more aggressive. Helicoverpa. It's way more aggressive and it can cause a lot of damage. And even though we do have some hot spots here in Brazil for Helicobacter and sorghum, but we can say it's a huge problem. Okay, but we do know that in Australia we have Helicobacter is a big issue in sorghum, and we do have some a good alternative for that. We have Vivus Max, which is I guess we mentioned it a couple of times here. It's a bioinsecticide based on baculovirus for all heliothymes. Okay, and just to sum up, because I don't have a lot of slides. Fall armyworm is a really challenging pest, but to be really honest, it's really fascinating too. Each year we see it evolving and adapting and changing its behavior. So it's really interesting to see how it develops. But it's really important for us, even though it's not critical on sorghum, like I said, it's really important that we control it, thinking about the whole system. Because if we don't control it correctly in sorghum, it will inevitably impact the following crops. So we see here a lot of damage caused in cotton and in corn, and we do have a lot of evidence, really robust scientific evidence to support that baculovirus is really effective against this pest, and including comparing to chemistry, and it's really it's effective, and it's a really great tool for IPM. And my final message here for you guys is that if you see fall armyworm in your sorghum fields, do not panic. We have a lot of really good products in our portfolio, and we have a lot of good alternatives, which are really good with a really good cost effectiveness, with low toxicity profile, and last but not least, great performance in the field.
Thank you, Gustavo. Does anybody have any questions, I suppose, for any of the panel members? And look, please feel free just to unmute, and I'm sure we'll sort it out if anybody has any questions.
Yeah, I've got a question, Gustavo, and please excuse my ignorance here, obviously being Australian. But with regards to the fall armyworm in cotton, are you guys growing BT cotton over there, or is it conventional cotton?
No, it's BT cotton. We do have some a mix of biotechnologies. We have what we call first generation of biotechnologies, and we have some technologies with Bogart 3 traits in it now. But most of it, I'd say it's Bogart 2. Most of the market is composed by Bogart 2 technology.
And that's what the fall armyworm is getting into?
Yes, I can help Gustavo on this. In Brazil, we got 1.5 million hectares of cotton, and 30% of this area is with Viptera trait that works for fall armyworm, and 70% of this area doesn't have any control. So the growers still doesn't have any control for fall armyworm, so we still have a problem for the growers. And they do spray up to 10 times in a crop cycle just for fall armyworm. So it's a huge problem for them.
Thank you.
And last time when I was speaking to the Brazilian team over there, I think one of the larger differences with regards to cotton is the fact that we are 95+% Bollgard 3 with the VIP3A content, which seems to hold the fall armyworm in place. Melina, if you were to rub your crystal ball and have a bit of a look into the future, what does this pest look like from your perspective, given where you're seeing it at the moment? Is this likely to be an ongoing pest you foresee with sorghum? Or given the level of parasitism and the massive uptake of Vivus Max use for Helix, are you likely to see, I think this will be a pest in the southern areas which will be of interest? And part B is this, what are your thoughts potentially about the further north we go if we're looking at central Queensland?
Yeah, I guess, you know, it is difficult to know what we're in for, and there is a lot of interest in Australia on around area-wide management approaches that might sort of mitigate some of this crop-to-crop movement over time. But I think the expectation is that the coastal areas all the way through Queensland and into northern New South Wales, maybe as far south as Sydney almost, and the areas north of central Queensland are considered to be higher risk because the potential for fall armyworm to persist year round is there. The other sorghum production areas, and I guess what we saw this last winter is that fall armyworm almost disappears entirely from the landscape. So we're then reliant on the movement of fall armyworm into those areas on an annual basis, perhaps at this time of year, as we saw last year. We certainly haven't seen that big movement yet this year, and the pressure is lower than it was at this time last year. So I guess that it seems unlikely that we'll see much of a change to that, and that really does put the emphasis on what happens in northern Australia over winter. And the area-wide management interest is around the major sweet corn production in the north, and the chemical profile, the sort of arsenal that they're targeting fall armyworm with, and the implications of that for movement of large populations from the north to the south. So, I guess we're sort of waiting to see how this pans out. And I was sort of interested in Gustavo's comment that, this is something that changes from year to year, and, perhaps there's not a standard sort of appearance and timing of fall armyworm movement, and that, we'll kind of be rolling with it as we go. But yeah, look, I think the majority of the sorghum growing areas we would expect to experience relatively low pressure. The issues might arise if there are years where fall armyworm turns up early, but the crops are planted late, and we get that, first couple of generations before the sorghum goes in.
I suppose that was my question with regards to central Queensland, and we might run a similar session early in January. But I mean, central Queensland sorghum is not planted till January, early February, which puts it slap bang in the middle of sort of the third or fourth generation. That's probably going to be a different scenario for us.
Can I ask a question of Gustavo and Murillo? With the difference in sorghum, from what we see with corn and the persistence of those populations through to the reproductive stages, do you have anything to, what would your sense be around why there's that difference? What is it about sorghum that results in fall armyworm populations not just continuing to build to sort of extreme levels by the time you get to that reproductive stage?
Good question.
Normally, sorghum it's a very low cost for growers, so they do not invest a lot. They only plant in areas where they got less rainfall, and but I don't know. It's really interesting question. I don't know if there's something regarding the plants. It's a good question, Melina.
Sorry, Phil. Just one comment that was made this week. I was up in central Queensland with a group of 20-odd agronomists up there for a meeting. And with regards to sorghum and their experience last year in central Queensland, they were saying that it wasn't a real issue with regards to yield or anything like that. But they found that when the fall armyworm got in there early, that it made it sort of tiller out a bit more. So rather than being a yield restricting pest, so to speak, it was more they found that last year it was more of a pest in the sense that when it came to actually managing the crop and bringing it off for harvest, they had varying levels of maturity of grain within the crop. Is that something you guys see over there, or Melina, you might be able to make a comment on that as well?
I'll let the more experienced people go first.
We do observe that this is more or less a threshold for the farmers. When they observe that the plants are tillering, they don't want that. So they make the decision of spraying. Because like Murillo said, it's a low investment crop. So most of the times they don't want to invest a lot, or they use the leftovers from soybeans. So they don't want you spray a lot of insecticides. But when they do see a lot of tillering, they are more like they tend to spray because of that. I don't really feel I want to complement something.
Certainly, certainly.
Yeah, that's quite interesting, Philip, because I guess my observations to date have been that Fall Armyworm actually quite like the tillers. And that was one of the things that, you know, sort of brought up a bit of a dichotomy between what a company like Pacific Seeds or Pioneer thought about, you know, the value of tillering. They actually would like to see a lot less of it in their, you know, and propose higher planting densities to manage that. But, you know, growers, and particularly in central Queensland, actually appear to like a bit of tillering. They think it's kind of hedges their bets on their yield potential. So, you know, I was of the opinion that, you know, potentially in those areas where they do like a bit of tillering or expect to get some tillering contributing to yield, that Fall Armyworm was more of a risk than a benefit. So, yeah, I guess, you know, Ian, this is probably one of the things that we're just going to have to watch and see, you know, how that interaction comes about.
Thanks, Melina.
So do we have any other questions for anybody on the panel more broadly? No, that being the case,
can I ask another one? Sorry.
Absolutely, Melina.
Just about Fawligen and the use of Fawligen in sorghum, and you know, one of the real challenges, I guess, thinking about how you deploy Fawligen against Fall Armyworm is what appears to be a very narrow window for efficacy. You know, if you're targeting against larvae that are more than about second instar, the efficacy drops off quite dramatically. How is that managed in a you know, what sort of recommendations do you make for growers around the timing of a Fawligen application? What do they need to see in the field, or is it done on a calendar?
Perhaps I think look, speaking from the Brazilian perspective, it's a low input crop, so there is not a great deal of attention paid to that. What I would suggest here is that we're going to be dealing with mixed populations that are likely to be predominantly Helicoverpa dominated. So by potentially putting Fawligen into the mix and targeting first and second instar larvae, you will take out a percentage of them. But by far and large, the best control method for it are going to be the beneficial insects in the crop, the parasites, the predators that are there. So if you're dealing with taking out the Helicoverpa with taking with Virus, you will then change the predator-prey ratio on the crop quite significantly. And the Fawligen, if it does take out a percentage of those smaller larvae, leaving the larger ones, then there's quite high levels of parasitism. I think that's potentially it. But you know, from what I'm understanding here, and I have a summary here in a minute, I really don't think that we're going to have huge problems with Fall Armyworm in reproductive sorghum. It'll probably be a bit of watching brief. But if we do end up with those larger larvae, we're not going to control them with Fawligen anyway. Probably a bit of a long answer to a short question there. I apologise, Melina. I'm aware of the time, everybody. So what I might just do is just run through just a bit of a quick summary here for us. We've got some pretty big knowledge gaps, and this is where I'm really looking forward to the work which Melina is going to be doing over the next couple of years, actually trying to fill some of these knowledge gaps physically around the pest. We know that around emergence from V2, V4, V6, potentially under very heavy pressure, we can run into trouble with Fall Armyworm physically in the crop. Once we get through the late vegetative stage, it can be quite cosmetic, but what we're hearing here is that we're not going to be seeing significant yield damage. We may see some delay in emergence. We may see some of those late tillers being a bit physically slow to come through. On head emergence, we've got a mixed population, which we believe is largely going to be Helicoverpa dominated. And if we've left well alone with regards to non-selective insecticides, we're going to still have pretty high levels of parasitism in there, which are going to help us enormously. The Virus Max going across the crop will take out the Helicoverpa, $10 to $15 a hectare. If we do need to add Fawligen and we can target those first and second instar larvae, that'll add probably another $20 a hectare to it. We do believe that we don't have any problems with mixing the two, but it is an option. But from what we're learning at the moment, potentially the Fall Armyworm in those heads is not going to be a huge problem. That's just in summary. From a support perspective, Ian, Caitlin and myself are on tap. We've recorded this session here, and I will pop that up onto our website. There's a lot of people who couldn't make it this morning who wanted to know if they could have a copy of it. We'll organise to circulate the fact that when I've published it, and that'll probably be on Monday. So please feel free to share it. Most of all, thank you very much for attending today. We really appreciate you attending, and thank you very much to our speakers, particularly Melina, Gustavo, and Brock. We really appreciate you plugging into this, and it is a work in progress. And we thank everybody. So look, thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.